Okay, well, let's get started. My name is Stephen Balkam. I'm the founder and CEO of the Family Online Safety Institute. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our first FOSI webinar of the year. And for those of you unfamiliar with FOSI, we are an independent nonprofit, a 501c3 charitable organization whose mission is to make the online world safer for kids and their families. We do that through what we call the 3 Ps of policy, practices, and parenting. That's enlightened public policy, robust industry best practices, and a project we call Good Digital Parenting. And we will be touching on all 3 of those Ps in our webinar today. So quite an interesting lineup we have. We're focusing today on, and the title of the webinar is the GenAI Generation, Shaping the Future. And so, not surprisingly, we're focusing on the technology development that changed the world in 2023, and that would be generative AI, also probably more well-known as ChatGPT or Bard. There are a number of many other GenAI apps out there, but it pretty much exploded into the public consciousness last year. And to try and capture what was going on, we released some research just last November about how parents and teens are using GenAI in their everyday lives, as well as their hopes and fears about it. By the way, this was a 3-country study. So it looked at folks in the US, in Germany, and Japan. Now, we're working to share these findings and resources with policymakers to arm them with the best information in order to craft effective laws and policies. And we'll focus on the public policy side in the second half of this webinar. And only just last week, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of Safer Internet Day. And as GenAI rises to prominence, so do questions about online safety in this new internet frontier. So with that in mind, we brought together today's guests to dive deeper into all things GenAI. And we are thrilled to have the researcher who conducted our study, Michelle Dickens, director at Kantar, joining us today. And Michelle, if you could come on screen, that would be great. Excuse me. And in addition, we have 2 of the participants from that recent research report. And as I mentioned, in the second half, we'll be joined by the Center for Democracy and Technology, Samir Jain, to dive more into the public policy side of this discussion. So welcome, Michelle. How are you?
Very good. Nice to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And by the way, for all of you watching, we encourage you to send us your questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to those during the discussion. So, Michelle, for those who haven't seen the report yet, and by the way, we will be putting out links throughout this discussion on the report and various other resources that we have. But give us some top lines. What was the report about? What surprised you? Just tell us a little bit about it.
Absolutely. So the research's purpose was to examine how parents and teens in the US, Germany, and Japan view and interact with a generative AI, including their awareness, their attitudes, concerns, as well as their current usage and perceptions of its benefits and risks. So this consisted of 2 legs of research. We had both qualitative and quantitative, and we did this and connected with over 3,000 parents and teens combined from July to September of last year. So some of the top lines and some things that were sort of stood out to me, it was interesting, first of all, to explore how just different cultures engage with this technology. And there were several surprises. So one of the things that really stood out was that Americans seem to be leading the way with about 2/3 of both parents and teens having tried generative AI. This was in contrast to Germany, where it was roughly around 50%, but especially Japan, where the numbers were lower, where we had only 30% and 29% of 30% of parents and 29% of teens who had tried it. Now, I will say that possibly when we start to dig into the data a little bit more, and we found that the Japanese numbers were probably more related to the fact that most of these apps and these services, these tools out there, are really English based. So we could see that grow in the future as there are more Japanese native programs. So it was also interesting to see how awareness and usage varied across the country. So in the US and Germany, parents tended to overestimate their teens' use of generative AI, while in Japan, awareness was just significantly overall. This was surprising to us, right? Because it's contrary to what most of us would think, right? That teens really, when it comes to tech topics, they're the ones who tend to be the experts. So that was a consistent surprise for all of us. So despite all these differences, both parents and teens across all three markets, they saw the value in generative AI. They had different priorities though, right? Parents focused more on the analytical aspects, but also creative tasks, things that could possibly help them, jumpstart an idea or jumpstart their thinking from everyday things like cooking to maybe a little bit more significant. Um, Teens, surprisingly enough, were more interested in creating efficiency with their work tasks at school.
Mm.
And that was really interesting to us. And those analytical tasks, they really wanted some help with. So they were a bit more pragmatic in many ways there. So the barriers, though, in trying AI, though, when we started to dig into it, were also different. So again, as I mentioned, teens are pretty practical when it came to trying it. But what really stood out there was that they lacked the time. They're busy. They have their friends, they have school, they have work. But there's also a bit of lack of interest, which was something that we thought that they would, again, we thought that they would be sort of the pioneers here, and they weren't. They're just, at this point, it's not just something that's really important, it's something that's really ringing bells at this moment. Parents, though, were more concerned about the sources of data, where this information was coming from, the potential outputs. Were they going to be accurate? Were they going to be misleading? So those things that really stood that really were barriers and concerns of theirs. So surprisingly, one thing that was interesting was that more people said that they were open to discussing personal and sensitive topics with generative AI. And what I mean by that is that, talking to somebody, maybe you have a concern, maybe you want to just hear somebody to kind of listen to you. Japanese parents they said that they told us that they felt most comfortable doing so. In
Mm.
fact, some teens that I even talked to mentioned that, talking with AI is a way to sort of maybe get their feelings out on paper, maybe to have someone listen to them was a good thing. And maybe it could help potentially with future mental wellness. So that kind of leads me to some of the things about the future. Looking forward, there was a strong belief that generative AI is going to be part of daily life, right? Something that we'll be using as much as we say we use, search today, right? Search came up quite a bit. A majority expected it to be really much a part of our lives. Both parents and teens agreed that Gen AI fluency will be critical for the future, with about 2/3 believing that it's going to be necessary for school and for career competitiveness. But however, there are concerns about the impact of Gen AIs, particularly regarding job loss, right? So this came up quite a bit. It is something in the back of people's minds, some maybe in some more the forefront. But spread of false information was also a concern about the future. And another thing that really came up consistently was the loss of critical thinking skills. This
Mm.
was really not just parroted by parents, but also teens themselves. So despite these concerns, most parents have discussed, AI with their teens. Although Japanese parents did tell us that they felt less informed. Um, Interestingly, parents preferred virtual, said that they would prefer to see or be a part of virtual classes to learn more about GenAI. They're very open to that. They want to hear more about it, about what to expect, how to kind of manage it. Teens are more interested in learning about it through social media. I don't think that was really much of a surprise for us, but it was something that came through strongly, and that especially was true in Japan. Um, Parents, they talked about themselves being the ones who are ultimately responsible for how their family interacts with GenAI, and sort of thinking about the how they're going to control it, and how they should potentially interact with it. And while the government and companies should be their support, they really took it on themselves as being the ones who really should be the ones who are most responsible. Transparent knowledge are very key issues for the future of GenAI. Parents across all 3 countries mentioned and ranked transparency of data practices as a top factor that's really going to address their concerns. So, I mean, it was clear to us that as GenAI becomes more integrated into our lives, understanding its implications and ensuring transparency is going to be crucial.
Oh, well, that's just brilliant. I had a number of questions, and as you spoke, you were answering my questions, so I appreciate that.
And we didn't practice it, did we?
My one observation is really interesting. We've been doing research for, I don't know, 15 years. So this is the first study where parents and teens felt like they were on equal footing of a technology. It's always been the teens who were ahead in terms of being early adopters, users, particularly of social media. And many of the apps. But this one, primarily because folks are using GenAI in the work setting, and there's some issues around, will this thing take my job away? I better get a handle on this. So at least for now, parents and teens are on equal footing. Before we bring our 2 guests in, we did have a question. Let me just see if I can get this. Was there any indication about how concerned people were about privacy and the use of their content and data going back into the LLM and or potentially used to track them? So a privacy question, Michelle.
Yeah, privacy did come up. We thought it was going to be highly ranked. We thought that this was going to be the ones that would be sort of at the top of the list. And while it is a concern about privacy, it wasn't as high as we thought it was going to be. I don't think that people right now are thinking that we're there. They're not connecting the dots at the moment to know how it works and how their presence sort of is there interacting with it as well. So while it was a latent concern, right now it just wasn't at the forefront from a lot of our conversations and from the data.
Interesting. All right, well, let's pause and let's invite our 2 guests in, Tiffany and Jake. Well, tell you what, Michelle, why don't you introduce our 2 of the folks who were involved in the research as respondents. So let's see if we can bring them both onto the screen.
Hello.
Hey.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, everyone. So I would like to introduce you to Tiffany Caines and Jakir Caines. And we spent some time together last year talking about generative AI, different conversations and focus groups. And before we get started, I just want to ask you, tell me about your experience. What did you think about our time together last year in our conversation?
I felt it was very informative. It really brought light to AI for me, and learning more about it.
What about you, Shakir?
I was like more aware of the AI, and like, yeah, that's really it.
Yeah, I mean, when we sat with you guys were in a group setting, listening to other people's concerns. Did you learn anything about AI, or were you sort of like, "Huh, I never really thought about that," when you were listening to others?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. Realize how much people use it and willing to use it.
Willing to use it, yeah. What about you, Shakir? What were some of the things that sort of kind of stood out to you listening to others and what they had to say?
It was like a little bit surprising on how like they use AI and the different ways we could use it.
How is it different from the way that you use it or
I
interact?
mean, I mean, I use it for like most of the time for content or like creating things for school or like just for personal stuff.
Okay, all right. So, I mean, I think when you think about about what you've heard the term AI, right? Especially now, what are the 2 or 3 words that really come to mind when you think of generative AI or Gen AI?
I think about like robot and computer, software.
Yeah, really any type of like computers or internet or the internet, like searching up like Safari or Google, you know.
So it kind of ties into this idea of you're looking for something and it can bring something up, yeah?
Yeah.
And have you ever thought about it in terms of maybe um, other ways that like of using it beyond just sort of practical or search or like you mentioned robots and computers, Tiffany?
Yes, I mean, I feel like as far as medical care, it can help with that, maybe helping providers be able to diagnose patients faster or find, problems with the patient.
Okay. Jakir, what about you?
I really just use it for like most of my schoolwork to like
So,
if I don't understand anything, I'll find like a video or something, or it can help me like explain the work for me.
Okay. Okay. So you're using it. What
Michelle,
tool? Oh
I
yeah,
had
go
a
ahead.
quick question for Jakir. Did you say when we talked earlier that you used it with Snap, or of people who use Snapchat and the AI?
I know of people that use the Snapchat.
And just describe what's that like and how are they using it?
Well, I mean, I heard some people use it just to like talk or like if they're not being heard, like Michelle was saying, and then or they would like use it for sometimes like for answers, kind of a little bit.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, Michelle.
No worries. Um, Tell me about so you haven't used it that way. What are the ones? Which tools do you use? Which generative AI tools do you use, Jakir? You said that you use it sometimes for school.
Yeah, it's this app called ChatGPT, and yeah, and this one like CapCut has like a little AI that could create like videos.
Have you used CapCut a lot?
Mm, sometimes, not recently, but I used to a lot.
You used to. What kind of videos were you putting together?
Like editing videos for like content, that's really it. Or sometimes it'll be for school, like a presentation for
Oh,
school. Yeah.
okay. What about you, Tiffany? Which ones have you been using? Which tools, apps, services have you been using that utilize generative AI?
mm, I guess, I mean, I don't know if like Alexa or Google Doc is kind of one of those, or I mean, I've used Snapchat, but I don't use it as much as this newer generation does.
But you've encountered chatbots, right?
Yes, I've used that.
Mhm.
Chat box, yes, I've used that before.
Yeah. What is your experience with those? Tell me about your experiences and your thoughts about chatbots when you do encounter them.
It's helpful sometimes, but sometimes it's just not like having one-on-one with a live person.
Mm.
It's good if you just need basic information, but if you need to be more generalized and you need to talk to a live person.
I have a question. Tiffany, you mentioned your own job and in healthcare. And of course, this technology is not going to stand still. It's just going to keep getting better and better. Do you or any of your colleagues have any concerns or worries that maybe it might start taking jobs away in what you do?
No, I don't think we have any worries, but it's just making sure you keep up with the technology and and knowing how to use it.
Hmm. Because it's definitely there's definitely a lot of development going on in the healthcare industry right now, to ease the pressure on doctors and nurses and so on, and to have people diagnosed from their homes rather than coming into clinics. And if that trend continued, then that could change things pretty dramatically.
Yes, yes, that is a way it could affect us nurses and stuff like that as well.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, over the last 6 months, I mean, since we last talked in a group setting, I want to know, have you heard more discussion either from your friends, your peers, even from work or school about generative AI? Or even just overall, just on the news?
Uh,
I'm sorry, say Jakir?
I would say not really.
Not really.
Nah.
So it seems about the same as when we last talked. What about you, Tiffany?
Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, have you, since we last talked last summer, what have you heard? Has anything changed? Have you been hearing more information, more news about generative AI? Have you seen
I feel
maybe
like
even
I've heard more about the AI since I've talked to you, and it's been more of a topic.
yeah, what's some of the things have you been hearing about it?
Just about like how students are using it to generate reports and papers and essays and stuff like that.
Hmm. Anything else outside of like work? Have you heard anything about generative AI in culture or within our country or anything like that?
No.
No. Okay. All right. So, it's interesting. We were talking earlier about the study, and the study found that both teens and parents generally know about the same amount about generative AI, right? AI and generative AI together. Is that your experience? Do you guys feel that you and Jakir are like the same level of knowledge and expertise?
Well, I don't know about the same of the knowledge and expertise. I think because of his generation, they use technology more. I think he's more aware versus, me, of course.
You think that you're about the same, or do you think you know more
No,
than?
I think I know.
Yeah, I mean, so if that's your experience, I mean, how do you guys talk about generative AI at home together, especially after the research? What was your
Yeah.
conversations afterwards? What did you guys talk about?
Yeah, after the research, I felt like we was able to like have that conversation, like, and make him aware more of using it and, not overusing it, so that he will still be able to think critical.
Mm. What were your thoughts on that, Jakir, when you had that conversation with your mom?
Yeah, I started to think more like use think for myself more, and instead of relying on the AI unless it's like my last option.
Oh, okay. Was that a bit different than before the research, you think? Because what's the worry there? What's the worry there that you have, and why you now want to use it more of as a last option?
Because like I feel like it's like colleges wouldn't like to get far in life, people wouldn't think you have to think critical to get like more far in life and like get the job that you want and the colleges that you want to go to and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Michelle, there's a question come in that's kind of related to this. And it's directed to you, Michelle, but I think Jakir, you might be able to answer this one too. Did you find any concerns among the teens about use of the results for schoolwork? Any plagiarism concerns, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the school is like they don't really, most of the times they don't really like using the AIs to do work for us. They're like, we could use it, but like don't plagiarize, like make it into your own words and like make sure you understand it as you're doing the work.
You know, and from the research after talking with folks, US, Germany, and Japan, there wasn't as much as concern about plagiarism as much as there was about critical thinking skills. That was what was expressed most, but I think the subtext of that has to do with a little bit of plagiarism, right? Doing work that's not yours, kind of taking some shortcuts. So there was some discussion about, yeah, doing, taking shortcuts. And then if for some reason you couldn't use it, you would be sort of flailing. We had a father who talked about that, like, hey, if you took a calculator away from you, right, would you still be able to do your math tables? Would you still understand how to do 6 times 5 without using the calculator? And that was sort of a concern. And so that's where more plagiarism came. It was again a more subtext of these things rather than that was the headline.
Okay. We're going to just wind this part of the conversation up. I actually have a final question for you, Michelle, which is what further research needs to be done in this space? And for that matter, Jakir and Tiffany, if you have any ideas, let us know. But Michelle, what comes to mind having done that report?
Yeah, we left obviously that this research and we were pretty excited because of all the things that we were like, all the what ifs, right, in the future. So a lot of it happened to be really people centered. So yes, what's going to be if I talk to Jakir and Tiffany and let's say 2-3 years from now, how would life be different? So this idea of kind of understanding how critical thinking might be impacted. What are people doing around that? The impacts upon creativity. I work in a field within market research, but I also was in advertising before, and I know there's been a discussion about, and also too heard from parents and from students about creativity. What is real creativity, and when does true creativity start, and when does AI end, sort of thing. That's that kind of the impacts into that. Looking into habit formation and how much we're using. I think I mentioned earlier that parents and teens thought that this is going to be part of life, like we use search. How does AI become part of our habits on a day-to-day basis? Gaming, also AI in terms of gaming. What will that mean in terms of competitiveness, and who you're interacting with? So that whole realm right there within the world of gaming, AI in the world of gaming, is something I know that some people on my team are interested in. And lastly, I think young people in political engagement, and how AI and some of the things that we talked about in terms of transparency. There was some concerns, again, as I mentioned earlier, of misinformation, misleading, people being misled. And so I could see maybe in the future to kind of keep an eye on and kind of really understand how how the younger folks are truly engaging and or civic duties, and how they're doing it, right? Are they attending meetings? Are they donating? Are they doing block walks? Or are they being more advocates from an online standpoint, and how? So this will be interesting to see how this nets out over the next few years.
Wow. Well, that's quite a menu of options there. Jakir, I saw you nodding a couple of times, particularly when she was talking about gaming. Was there any final points you wanted to make?
I mean, when you have like the Gen AI, they could like use that to create different games and stuff. I would say that would be good. But yeah.
Cool. And Tiffany, any final thoughts?
No, not at the moment.
All right. Well, listen, I want to thank you both very, very much for being a part of the research, and Michelle for conducting the research and for explaining it so coherently and cogently. The link is in the chat, I believe, down below. And with that, I want to thank the three of you, and you can now take yourselves off screen, and we're going to invite our next guest, thanks again, Michelle. Our next guest to join us, Samir Jain. There you are. Hey, Samir.
Hello.
How
Hi,
you
how are
doing?
you? Good.
Why don't you introduce yourself and what is it you do and what is it that your organization is all about?
Sure. So my name is Samir Jain. I'm the Vice President of Policy at an organization called the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT. And CDT is an organization that's been around really for over 25 years, really since the advent of the commercial internet. And we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and our goal is really to fight for the civil liberties and civil rights of people when they use the internet and other technologies. And really that takes the form of promoting privacy, free expression online, and democratic values more generally. And, as Vice President of CDT, I oversee our policy work on all of these work streams and really look for ways for us to advocate for those values, both in the policy realm and with companies more directly.
Brilliant. I'm a huge CDT fan, and I think attended the first meeting in 1995. I'm going to date myself here, but you guys have been a force for extraordinary coherence and good policy making, shall I say, since the early days of the web. You've just listened in, Samir, to that conversation, and you also heard Michelle describe the research report. Just right off the bat, what do you think are some of the more important takeaways for policymakers having heard that discussion?
So I'd say a couple of things. One is it was interesting to hear that this was one of the newer, one of the few technologies where teens and parents are sort of on the same level. And I think one of the things that points to is the importance of education sort of at all levels in terms of education about the capabilities of these technologies, but also their limits, about the possibility that they create hallucinations and aren't always accurate, and how you assess that. The education about what are some of the benefits, but also what are some of the dangers. We heard about privacy as well as a potential risk that's associated with this. And I think from a policymaker standpoint, both about how do we promote that education, and then more generally, what are the right policy levers for maximizing the benefits of this technology, while at the same time addressing some of the risks that we heard about.
Well, let's dive in a little bit more into the education, because I know CDT has been doing some work on GenAI in the classroom. Let's just start with your sort of philosophical approach. Is this a good thing, not a good thing? If it's a good thing, how is it? And obviously, what are the issues that you have to be aware of, and maybe even harms that you're going to have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that AI generally, and generative AI, can have benefits in the classroom and in education, in areas like personalized learning, or in terms of providing support in the research and other kinds of areas. So I think there's no question that it can have potential benefits. I think at the same time, of course, we heard earlier in the conversation about risks around plagiarism as one potential risk. But more broadly, I think there are also concerns in making sure that we put in place appropriate policies and governance, and that schools treat this technology appropriately. So, for example, when we did some survey research during the summer, sort of coming off of the first school year in which GenAI sort of made its appearance. And one of the striking findings of that research was that there's a real gap in perception. 90% of teachers thought that students were using GenAI or had used GenAI in their schoolwork, while only 23% of students reported that they, in fact, had used it in their schoolwork. And, that gap, I think, contributed to sort of a concern that there may be a gap in trust, that teachers are increasingly less trustful that work that students are turning in is, in fact, their own. And concerns about plagiarism and the like, whereas students aren't using it so often, at least as of that then, weren't using it so often. And that gap in trust can be pernicious in general, but also can also manifest itself in disciplinary actions. And we already know that in schools, there's often a gap or a discriminatory gap between minorities and other marginalized communities who are more likely to face discipline in schools. And we need to make sure that generative AI doesn't end up contributing to that, so that teachers become even less more suspicious of those in in marginalized communities. And that results in even greater disciplinary discrepancies. We saw a little bit of a hint of that in some of our survey results last year. And so I do think it points to the importance of schools having in place clear policies, education of both teachers and students about, what are the benefits of Gen AI, how can be used constructively, and how to stay away from some of the problems.
Okay, all right. So we heard question marks about privacy in the first half of this discussion. CDT has been involved for nearly 3 decades to get a federal privacy bill passed, and we still have not done so. So given the context of no federal privacy protection, what are your concerns about our data and where all of this is going into these LLMs that seem to be scraping up everyone's data?
Yeah, I mean, I think privacy legislation really is a foundational pillar, should be a foundational pillar of AI regulation more generally, because I think AI or generative AI has the potential to certainly exacerbate a lot of the privacy problems that we've seen before. Because as you said, data is sort of the lifeblood of AI in terms of training the AI systems. And we've seen that generative AI, for example, sometimes memorize the training data, including personal information that it's trained on, and then regurgitate that as part of its output. And so unauthorized disclosure of personal information. It can also be used to to generate even more targeted kinds of harmful content and advertising by taking in data about individuals and creating content that's targeted toward individuals. And so some of the kinds of problems we've seen with targeted content can be exacerbated even more with AI to ingesting all of this data and then using it to generate more personalized content. So I think a lot of and then people tend to often have very intimate conversations with chatbots, right? They may disclose information about their mental state, about reproductive health care that they need, or other kinds of healthcare information. And to the transcripts of those conversations, in the same way that search queries can be private, those kinds of transcripts can be even more private. And what do we do? How do we protect that kind of information as well?
Right. Okay, so let's, and by the way, this issue reverberates obviously across the country, but also in Europe, also around the world, basically. So we're going to do a little tour, but let's start in the US. And you guys have been really at the forefront of thinking about and trying to draft policy ideas for the US. And when I saw the executive order from the president last year, it just looked like a lot of what I've been reading from CDT. Is that an accurate read? Would you like to take all of the credit, or and just obviously no one ever gets everything that they want. Where do you think are the strengths of the executive order, and where are the weaknesses?
I mean, we were quite happy with the executive order because I think it identifies a lot of the current risks that AI presents in the form of, for example, potential discrimination and bias, and really doles out in many ways a lot of homework assignments to a lot of different parts of the government in terms of thinking about what are the potential risks, what is guidance that can be used to address some of those risks. It puts a lot of work to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the Department of Commerce to come up with best practices around both generative AI and managing the risk of generative AI and AI more broadly when AI is used in decision-making, for example. So it's used to just decide whether someone gets a loan or not, or it can be used in the education context in terms of, decisions about people's placement or whether or not they get a job. So it's used in so many important decision-making contexts. And in those cases, we need to make sure that it's being used in a way that's fair, in a way that is effective, and that actually accomplishes the goals that it's purported to do. And I think the executive order rightly focused on a lot of those goals.
All right. Well, let's stay at the national level still. What hope do you have that this or any future Congress is going to pass any kind of coherent AI bill?
Well, look, on the one hand, I give credit to Congress and particularly the Senate side for trying to, for having a lot of very thoughtful conversations about this. Senator Schumer convened these AI insight forums and drew a lot of different experts to the table. And, they've really tried to approach it in a bipartisan way. And I think there's been a lot of good faith efforts by staffers in particularly, again, on the Senate side, but also on the House side to learn more about this technology. So I think there's been actually quite a bit of effort on trying to get up to speed, trying to learn, and trying, not to make sure that Congress tries to at least keep pace with the technology a little bit more than they have with technologies in the past. Now, having said all that, that doesn't necessarily mean translate into, and there's going to be legislation that's going to pass. I mean, we all see how Congress isn't really functioning well. And, there's obviously, once you go from high-level principles to actual legislation, some of the partisan differences are going to surface again, I think, as well. So, we're going to continue to engage with Congress and hopefully have good conversations. But, that it's difficult to get legislation passed in any Congress, and this Congress in particular, I think.
Well, which brings me to my next point, which is there's an awful lot going on in the states. Partly because states like to do things, but also they look at the dysfunction in Washington and say, well, forget that. We'll do our own in Wyoming, in Delaware, in wherever. Are you optimistic, pessimistic, don't really mind? Where are you guys at all of this state level activity?
Look, I mean, at some level, we always talk about states as laboratories of democracy. And, particularly when you're talking about a new technology, there's some value in some experimentation and trying different policy approaches. That said, there is a danger in the notion of having a patchwork and having potentially inconsistent regulations or, regulations that, don't work well with one another and that cause more problems than not. And particularly in the area of kids and kids' safety, which is where we've seen a lot of the state activity lately. I think we've seen some laws that really raise some concerns from our perspective. Laws that, for example, might limit the ability of teens in particular to have access to content that they need, whether it's in the reproductive healthcare context or gay and lesbian teens having access to particular content. A lot of states have gone the route of age verification type laws, which we think present some real problems from a privacy perspective and from a anonymous speech perspective. So we have some significant concerns with some of what the states are doing, but do understand the frustration in the absence of federal action.
Well, actually, let's go back up to the federal level because we saw overnight there's been a development on COSA, the Kids Online Safety Act. And why don't you just give us your top line of what COSA is all about and whether you think the changes made to COSA will make it more palatable and desirable to turn it into law?
Yeah, so COSA is a Kids Online Safety Act, and the intention there, the good intention, is to look at how social media, and I think GenAI falls within the scope of it as well, services are designed and to try to induce providers to design more with kids' safety in mind. And again, that goal is a laudable goal, one we certainly support. I think the concern with COSA has been that its approach, or one of its primary approaches, is imposing what's called a duty of care on service providers, and a duty of care to essentially take steps to try to prevent certain kinds of harms to kids, such as harms to mental health or harms to safety or bullying and things like that. And at least as it had been written, it could well have been interpreted or given the power to, for example, to state attorneys general, for them to say that, for example, certain types of content about reproductive health care services, content about gender identity, content that's supportive of lesbian and gay kids, was harmful to mental health. And therefore, that service providers had to restrict access to that kind of content. And that, to us, was quite a concerning outcome, potential outcome from those bills. And so, we had some real concerns about that. Now, as you said, the version that has just been released today, I think the intention is to try to address some of those concerns by putting more of a focus on what the bill calls design features of the social media and less on the content. We're still analyzing the new language to see if it really fully accomplishes that goal. But I think that's our basic take is that yes, kids' safety is important. We need to pursue it, but the way to pursue it is not by trying to restrict content, particularly content that in many cases can be lifeline for kids in marginalized communities.
Right, right. Okay, so let's now look overseas. And your CEO, Alex Gibbons, attended the first AI summit in Bletchley Park in the UK, I believe, last year. And of course, we now have the EU's AI Act as well. Where you guys sanguine about all of this? Are you supportive of where the Brits and the Europeans are going? What are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, so the AI Act takes what's called a risk-based approach. It tries to identify, risks of particular uses of AI, categorize them as unacceptable or high or medium risks, and then attaches certain obligations depending on, what level of risk a particular application has. Now, it was written really before ChatGPT and generative AI exploded onto the world, at least initially, and generative AI and more general purpose AI systems like chatbots present a little bit of a problem for the EU AI Act in the sense that they can be used for a variety of purposes. So they, if they're used in the context of hiring, maybe they're high risk. If they're used in, creation of art, maybe they're low risk. And so I think, they sort of got at the end grafted onto the AI Act in terms of how it's dealt with. And, for most generative AI and general purpose AI systems, there's some transparency requirements. And then for the most frontier models, there are some additional risk assessments. I think the general idea that, you need to look at the risks, assess those risks, and then try to mitigate those risks makes a lot of sense. I think there are a lot of questions around the implementation of the AI Act, and a lot is going to depend on that. And that's what we're going to turn to now that it looks like it's going to finally pass.
And anything else you're seeing around the world? Anything coming out of Australia, for instance, or Japan, or anything else that might either concern you or encourage you in terms of other legislation?
I mean, I think what's encouraging in some respects is that in all of these different conversations that are taking place internationally, there is a fair amount of consensus on principles, on sort of what we want to achieve at a high level, and on the need to, avoid bias, the need for safety, the need for efficacy. And so there's really a fair amount of consensus around those principles. I think where we're all challenged, and that's true at the national levels, it's true sort of all the way down to company level, is how do we operationalize those principles? How do we take those principles and make them practical and make them real? And that's where the challenge is. And I think, I think there is a lot of good work taking place. I mentioned NIST earlier. There's, the Safety Institute that the United Kingdom is establishing as well. I think in the EU, they're also looking at these things, but figuring out how do we measure some of these biases and problems? How do we audit for them? I think these are questions that we're at the very early stages of, and I think there's a lot of commitment to trying to get to the right place on those, but there's still a lot of work to be done too, I think.
Okay, well, let's bring it back to the present day. And here we are in Washington, D.C., the two of us. in an election year. Any concerns about Gen AI and the election?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you know, we've had for, you know, certainly since 2016 issues with elections around the misinformation and disinformation and the propagation of that through social media services and what that does to our information environment. And there's certainly a concern that generative AI might make that problem worse. It can make that problem worse, for example, through the use of deep fakes, which are, you know, videos or images that are altered that make it seem like someone said or did something that they didn't do. And we've seen a little bit of that already in elections, in the election context, both internationally and here, where candidates have put out videos or images of their opponents purporting to do something that they didn't do. And on top of that, generative AI can be used for more, as I was talking about, more personalized content. And so we could see generative AI being used to try to suppress certain communities from voting and trying to you know, more targeted disinformation to individuals in particular communities. And so, you know, there's a real question of what our information environment is going to look like and how we as individuals and voters are going to be able to distinguish between what's authentic and real content and authoritative content from what is fake content.
Yeah. There was a new twist to this. Rather distressingly, one of the candidates, shall we say, was quoted something he had said at a rally, and he turned around and said, no, that wasn't me, that was AI. So this kind of deniability, it wasn't even plausible, but this deniability of something that someone has said into this bucket called AI really concerned me about the future of our democracy. Because if you can't be grounded, and I know we've been struggling in this country for a long time on this, if you can't be grounded in facts and the truth, and then on top of that, you then have this get out clause that anything that anyone says you've said or done is the work of, you know, malicious actors. I don't know what grounds upon which we can have any debates. Sorry to come down rather depressingly, but that, I don't know if you saw that, but that was a really distressing thing to have read.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's, I think a phrase that's often used here is a liar's dividend, in the sense that it's not only that you can't trust the fake content, but it has the effect of undermining trust in authentic and real content. And it makes it very difficult for individuals as voters to parse, you know, is this real, or do or it really undermines their trust in all of the content they're seeing and all of the videos that they're seeing online, because they know some of it's going to be fake and they have no way of, you know, differentiating between the two.
All right. One final question, and it's actually from the audience. And I don't know if you have any children in your life or ever, you know, studied psychology at college, but at what age would it be useful to introduce the understanding of AI to children?
I do have two teens, and you know, I just think, I think it's less a question of when do you introduce AI or technology more generally. It's a question of sort of what aspects and how do you do it in stages? Because I think it's in our society largely inescapable, even for, you know, kids in elementary school. It's just the reality that they're going to encounter it. They're going to encounter it in schools. They're going to encounter it from their friends. And it's better, I think, for them to encounter it in a way where they're equipped to deal with it, and equipping children to deal with it rather than trying to deny the reality of those technologies, because I think they're going to encounter it in any way. And so I think it's really important for us to be focused on how do we empower kids in their use of technology. And empowering, I think, in part is education and making sure they understand sort of the benefits, the risks, you know, the fact that generative AI can generate fake content, so you can't fully rely on it. So there's an education piece, but it's also, I think, that, you know, from and I say this really from a policy standpoint too, that making sure that we focus in our policy solutions on tools and ways to empower kids, so that it's less about saying you can't access this content or you can't get on messaging services, and more about how do we provide them tools so that, you know, if they encounter unwanted content or harmful content, that they have ways and methods of dealing with it, not only talking to their parents, which is of course an important piece, but also, ways to block and filter content, ways to report it to companies in a way that's meaningful, that they'll get transparency back and know that the reporting was actually effective, and focusing on how do we educate and empower kids in their use of technology.
Brilliant. Well, what a great place to end. Those were all my talking points to finish with, Samir. So I appreciate you doing that. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. Just for everyone to know, this webinar will be up on our YouTube channel fairly shortly. There are a ton of resources that my colleagues have been putting in the chat. Particularly recommend the Good Digital Parenting Tools sheet called GenAI Conversation Starters to help families with conversations with their kids. So with that, thank you. Thank you so much, Samir, and to Michelle, and to our two folks who helped us with the research. And we will be seeing you again shortly. Take care for now. Bye-bye.